The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Silverbrook, a small mining town where progress moved as slowly as the desert wind. Of the Southwest clung to its old ways like tumbleweeds to barbed wire. Ayanna Crowfeather walked carefully along the town's main street, her worn leather shoes making soft sounds against the wooden sidewalk. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet dignity her grandmother had taught her, head high, shoulders straight, never giving them a reason to say the Apache girl was anything less than human. Her dark hair was neatly braided, her simple cotton dress clean despite being patched in several places. She had come to town to collect her weekly pay from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. It wasn't much money, but it was honest work, and it helped her family survive on the reservation 20 miles outside town. The morning had started like any other, but as Ayanna approached Henderson's boarding house, she noticed something was wrong. A crowd had gathered outside Murphy's General Store across the street. Raised voices carried on the hot air, and she could see Sheriff Coleman's broad-brimmed hat bobbing above the crowd. Someone broke into Murphy's last night, she heard Mrs. Patterson telling her neighbor. Took money from the till and scattered goods all over the floor. Ayanna's stomach tightened. In a town like Silverbrook, it wouldn't be long before suspicious. Eyes turned toward the reservation. She quickened her pace toward the boarding house, hoping to collect her pay and leave before there she is. The voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. Ayanna turned to see Tommy Murphy, the store owner's son, pointing directly at her. His face was flushed red with anger, and something else, the kind of cruel satisfaction that came from having someone to blame. "That's the Apache girl who was hanging around the store yesterday," Tommy shouted, his voice carrying across the street. "I saw her looking through the windows, casing the place." The crowd began to turn, faces swiveling toward Ayanna like sunflowers following the sun. She felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Yesterday, she had indeed looked through Murphy's windows not to case the store, but to admire a blue dress. That reminded her of the sky over her grandmother's favorite mesa. She had stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, dreaming of wearing something so beautiful before reality reminded her that such dreams weren't for girls like her. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his weathered face already set in grim lines. At 55, he had been keeping the peace in Silverbrook for over 2 decades, and he had learned that the easiest way to maintain order was to give people someone to blame quickly. "Miss Crowfeather," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "I need to have a word with you." Ayanna stood perfectly still, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. "When they come for you with accusations, meet them with dignity. Truth is like water, it will find its way to the surface eventually." "Sheriff Coleman," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "How can I help you?" The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the promise of drama. Faces that had been merely indifferent to her presence in the past now showed open hostility. Mrs. Patterson clutched her purse tighter. Old Mr. Hobbs spat tobacco juice into the dust and muttered something about troublemakers from the reservation. "Tommy here says he saw you scoping out his father's store yesterday," Sheriff Coleman said, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Belt says you were acting suspicious, looking around like you were planning something." "I was looking at a dress in the window," Ayanna replied honestly. "I didn't go inside. I didn't take anything." "That's what they all say," sneered Pete. Morrison, a local ranch hand who had never liked seeing reservation Indians in town. "Give 'em an inch, and they'll take a mile." Probably had her whole family planned out for the heist. "My family lives on the reservation," Ayanna said, her voice growing quieter as the crowd grew louder. "They had nothing to do with this. I had nothing to do with this." But her words were lost in the growing murmur of the crowd. Fear was transforming into anger, and anger was searching for a target. In Silverbrook, that target had always been easy to find. Sheriff Coleman raised his hand. "For quiet. Now, folks, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need evidence, not just accusations." For a moment, Ayanna felt a flutter of hope. Maybe justice would prevail. "Maybe I found this behind the store this morning," Tommy Murphy said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small beaded hair ornament, the kind Apache women made for special occasions. "It looks like Indian work to me." Ayanna's blood ran cold. She touched her hair instinctively, feeling for the ornament her grandmother had made for her last birthday. It was gone. She remembered now she had felt it slip from her hair yesterday as she walked past the alley behind Murphy's store. She had looked for it briefly, but hadn't been able to find it in the tall weeds. "That's mine," she whispered, knowing how the words would sound to the crowd. "But I lost it yesterday. I didn't break into anything." The crowd's murmur rose to a rumble. Someone called out, "Caught, red-handed." Another voice added, "What more proof do you need?" Sheriff Coleman took the ornament from Tommy and examined it in the morning light. The beadwork was intricate, beautiful, clearly the work of skilled hands, but to him, it was just evidence of guilt. "Miss Crowfeather," he said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for breaking and entering, theft." "But I didn't," Ayanna began, but her words were drowned out by the crowd's approval. "Should have known better than to trust an Indian," someone called out. "They're all thieves and liars," added another voice. As Sheriff Coleman approached with handcuffs, Ayanna looked around desperately for a friendly face, someone who might speak up for her. But the eyes that met hers were filled with suspicion, anger, and a kind of satisfied righteousness that made her stomach turn. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway of her boarding house with her arms crossed, shaking her head in disappointment. Even she, who had seen Ayanna's honest work ethic day after day, seemed ready to believe the worst. The metal handcuffs were cold against Ayanna's wrists. As Sheriff Coleman led her toward the jail, the crowd followed, their voices growing bolder. With each step, "Make sure she doesn't escape, like her ancestors did. Probably got family waiting to break her out. Should send her back where she came from." The jail was a small stone building at the end of Main Street, designed to hold drunks and petty criminals for a few days at most. But as they approached, Sheriff Coleman seemed to hesitate. "Sheriff," called out Mayor Whitman, a portly man who ran the town's only bank, "might be better to keep her somewhere more secure, at least until the circuit judge comes through next month." "What are you suggesting?" Coleman asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Old Murphy's got that barn out back of his store, solid walls, good lock. Keep her there until we can sort this mess out proper." Ayanna felt her knees go weak. A barn. They were going to lock her in a barn like an animal. Her grandmother's stories of the old days, when Apache people were hunted and caged, suddenly felt very real and very close. "That's not legal," she said quietly. "You can't just lock someone in a barn. You lost your rights when you decided to steal from honest folk," Tommy Murphy spat. "Lucky we don't just run you out of town on a rail." Sheriff Coleman looked uncomfortable. For a moment, some part of him recognizing that this wasn't right, but the crowd was watching, and in Silverbrook, the crowd's will often became the law. "It's just temporary," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Until the judge comes." The barn behind Murphy's store was old and weathered, used mostly for storage now. It smelled of hay and motor oil, and thin streams of sunlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. There was a small window high up on one wall, too high to reach, and the only door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron strapping Dot as they pushed her inside. Ayanna turned to face the crowd one last time. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice carrying across the hot afternoon air. "I didn't steal anything, and someday the truth will come out." The door slammed shut with a sound like thunder. She heard the heavy bolts slide into place, then the click of a padlock. Footsteps and voices gradually faded as the crowd dispersed. Satisfied that justice had been served, alone in the dim barn, Ayanna sank to her knees in the hay. The smell of dust and old wood surrounded her, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to cry. Not for the injustice, she had expected that, but for the loneliness, for the feeling that, in a world full of people, she was completely and utterly alone. Outside, the sun continued its relentless journey across the Arizona sky, indifferent to the pain of one Apache girl locked away in a barn, forgotten by a town that had never really seen her as human in the first place. But in a large house on the hill overlooking Silverbrook, someone was watching the commotion below with growing concern. Someone who had built his fortune on knowing, when something didn't add up, someone who was about to change everything. High above the dusty streets of Silverbrook, in a mansion that seemed to watch over the town like a silent guardian, William Theodore Ashford III stood at his study window with a cup of morning coffee growing cold in his hands. At 42, he was the wealthiest man for 100 miles in any direction. His fortune built on silver mines, cattle ranches, and the kind of shrewd business sense that had carried his family name for 3 generations. But this morning, wealth felt like a burden rather than a blessing. From his elevated position, he had watched the entire scene unfold below. He had seen the crowd gather, heard the shouting even from this distance, and witnessed a young woman being led away in handcuffs. What troubled him wasn't just the mob mentality. He had seen that before in boomtowns like Silverbrook. Troubled him was what he had witnessed the night before. William had suffered from insomnia for years, a consequence of the business pressures that came with managing a small empire. Last night had been particularly restless, and around 2 in the morning, he had given up on sleep and settled into his study to review mining reports. His desk faced the window that overlooked the town, and from this vantage point, he could see clear down Main Street. It was then that he had seen the real thief. A figure had moved stealthily along the shadows of the buildings, staying close to the walls where the moonlight couldn't reach, even from a distance. William could tell it was a man too tall and broad-shouldered to be the young Apache woman now sitting in Murphy's barn. He had watched as the figure pried open the back door of Murphy's store, disappear inside for several minutes, then emerge and hurry away toward the residential area on the east side of town. William had considered calling out, perhaps firing a warning shot from the rifle he kept in his study. But the distance was too great, and by the time he could have roused anyone, the thief would have been long gone. He had made a mental note to speak with Sheriff Coleman in the morning, thinking it would be a simple matter of describing what he had seen. He hadn't expected the town to arrest an innocent girl instead. Now, as he watched the last of the crowd disperse, William felt the weight of moral obligation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. In Silverbrook, William Ashford's word carried tremendous weight in business matters. But this was different. This involved race, class, and the kind of deep-seated prejudices that had roots going back generations. He set down his coffee cup and walked to his desk, where a silver-framed photograph showed him with his late wife, Margaret, at their wedding 20 years ago. She had been the moral compass of their partnership, always pushing him to use his wealth and influence for good. Cancer had taken her 3 years ago, but her voice still guided him in moments like this. "What would you do, Maggie?" he asked the photograph quietly, but he already knew the answer. Margaret would have been down there in the street, demanding justice for that girl, regardless of the consequences. William straightened his tie, put on his best jacket, and prepared to walk into the storm. The walk from Ashford Manor to Main Street took 20 minutes, winding down a path through perfectly manicured gardens and then along the dusty road that connected the wealthy district to the town proper. With each step, William rehearsed what he would say to Sheriff Coleman. The facts were simple enough. He had witnessed the real burglary, and an innocent person was being held illegally in a barn. But he knew that simple facts often became complicated when filtered through human prejudice and small-town politics. The sheriff's office was quiet when William arrived, the morning's excitement having died down. Sheriff Coleman sat behind his desk, filling out paperwork with the methodical slowness of a man who preferred action to administration. "Morning, Mr. Ashford," Coleman said, looking up with surprise. It wasn't often that the town's wealthiest resident paid personal visits to the jail. "What brings you down here today?" "I need to talk to you about the Murphy break-in," William said, settling into the chair across from Coleman's desk. "I think there's been a mistake." Coleman's expression grew guarded. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where you arrest an innocent person based on circumstantial evidence." William kept his voice level and professional. "I saw the real burglar last night, Sheriff, from my study window. It was around 2 in the morning." The older man leaned back in his chair, studying William, with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people over 2 decades of law enforcement. "You sure about that, Mr. Ashford?" "It was dark. You were looking from quite a distance, I'm sure. It was a man, definitely not that young woman you have locked up. Too tall, wrong build entirely. He came from the east side of town, broke in through the back door, was inside for maybe 10 minutes, then headed back the same way he came." Coleman frowned, tapping his pencil against the desk. "Why didn't you say something earlier? Why didn't you call out or fire a warning shot?" "I considered it, but the distance was too great. I figured I'd talk to you this morning, and you'd investigate properly before making any arrests." William leaned forward slightly. "I didn't expect you to lock up the first Indian you could find. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Coleman's face reddened slightly, but whether from embarrassment or anger, William couldn't tell. "Now see here, Mr. Ashford. We didn't arrest her because she's Indian. We arrested her because Tommy Murphy saw her casing the store, and we found her property at the scene of the crime. Her property that she lost accidentally while walking past the store," William replied calmly. "Property that anyone could have found and planted as evidence. You're suggesting someone framed her. I'm suggesting that you arrested the wrong person based on flimsy evidence and racial prejudice. And now, an innocent girl is locked in a barn like an animal, while the real thief walks free." Sheriff Coleman stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Mr. Ashford, I respect you and your family's contributions to this town, but I can't just release a prisoner because you think you saw something from half a mile away in the middle of the night." William had expected this resistance, but it still frustrated him. Then investigate. Question the neighbors on the east side of town. Look for other evidence. But don't leave that girl locked up while you do. She's fine where she is. Murphy's barn is secure, and it's illegal," William interrupted, his professional composure finally cracking slightly. "You know damn well you can't just lock someone in a barn indefinitely. What happens when the circuit judge finds out you've been holding a prisoner in unofficial custody?" This seemed to give Coleman pause. The monthly visits from the circuit judge were the closest thing Silverbrook had to higher legal authority, and judges didn't look kindly on sheriffs who bent the rules too far. Consider your information, Mr. Ashford, but I can't just release her on your word alone. Too many people saw the evidence, heard the accusations. If I let her go now without solid proof of her innocence, this town might tear itself apart." William stood up as well, recognizing that he had pushed as far as he could in this first conversation. "Then find the proof, Sheriff, because I'm telling you, you've got the wrong person, and I won't stand by and watch an innocent girl suffer for it." As he left the sheriff's office, William could feel Coleman's troubled gaze following him. He had planted the seed of doubt, but he knew it would take more than one conversation to change the course of Silverbrook's justice. The walk back up the hill gave him time to think. If official channels wouldn't work quickly enough, he would have to consider unofficial ones. He had contacts throughout the territory, people who owed him favors or relied on his business. Perhaps one of them could help investigate the real crime. But first, he wanted to see the alleged criminal for himself. Murphy's General Store sat in the middle of Main Street like a monument to small-town commerce. The building was old but well-maintained, with large windows displaying everything from work clothes to household goods. William had shopped there occasionally over the years, though his household staff usually handled such mundane tasks. The barn sat behind the store, connected by a short alley that was barely wide enough for a wagon. It was here, William realized, that he had seen the real thief disappear the night before. The back door of the store opened directly onto this alley, making it the perfect entry point for someone who knew the layout. As he approached the barn, William could hear no sound from within. For a moment, he wondered if perhaps the girl had been moved elsewhere, or if she had somehow escaped. But then he heard it, a soft sound that might have been singing, or perhaps praying in a language he didn't recognize. The barn door was secured, with a heavy iron bolt and a large padlock. There was no guard, no one watching. The town had simply locked her away and forgotten about her. Confident that justice had been served, William walked around the building until he found the small window he had noticed from a distance. It was about 8 feet off the ground, barely. Large enough for a person to squeeze through, and covered with iron bars that looked like they had been added recently. "Miss," he called softly toward the window, "Miss Crowfeather." The singing stopped. There was a long pause, then a voice answered from within, young, clear and tinged with suspicion. "Who's there? My name is William Ashford. I live in the house on the hill. I wanted to talk to you." Another pause. "Are you here to mock me too? To tell me what a savage I am?" The pain in her voice hit William like a physical blow. "No, miss, I'm here because I don't think you committed any crime." He heard movement inside the barn, the rustle of hay, then saw a shadow appear at the barred window. Even in the dim light filtering through the wooden walls, he could see her proud and marked by a dignity that no amount of false imprisonment could break. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why do you believe me when no one else will?" William looked up at her. This young woman who had been condemned by his town, his neighbors, his society. Because I saw who really robbed Murphy's store, and it wasn't you. For the first time since her ordeal began, Ayanna Crowfeather allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: hope. 3 days after Ayanna's imprisonment, Silverbrook had settled into smug complacency. The townspeople felt that justice had been served, giving little thought to the young Apache woman locked in Murphy's barn. But William Ashford couldn't stop thinking about her, driven by doubt and a growing sense of moral urgency. William launched his own investigation. He began at the boarding house where Ayanna had worked for years. Initially hesitant, the landlady eventually admitted Ayanna had been an exemplary employee, honest, reliable, and hardworking. Yet, prejudice remained, Ayanna's heritage made her a target despite her spotless record. Similar stories emerged across town. People who had known Ayanna acknowledged her integrity, but still harbored racist assumptions. William uncovered a clear contradiction: a community that respected her individually, yet discarded her collectively. The moment suspicion arose, his breakthrough came during a visit to Murphy's store. The break-in showed signs of professional execution, forced entry with heavy tools, selective theft of valuable and mobile items, and missing ammunition. A stranger had been in town days earlier, a large man with a scar, Texas accent, and a curious interest in store inventory. Despite these red flags, no one had reported him. Instead, the town focused on Ayanna after finding one of her ornaments, and based on flimsy eyewitness claims, determined to understand more. William visited the Apache reservation. There, he met Ayanna's grandmother, Maria Crowfeather, a proud, sharp-eyed elder who questioned his motives. William assured her of his intent to prove Ayanna's innocence. Maria explained how Ayanna had been raised to bridge two worlds, but how prejudice always made her vulnerable. She warned William that helping her granddaughter would cost him dearly more than money. That evening, William pieced together the growing body of evidence. The crime bore the hallmarks of a coordinated gang that had struck other towns using similar methods. The town's eagerness to blame an Apache girl was not just about racism, but also fear and the need for a scapegoat to preserve social order. A knock at William's door interrupted his thoughts. Outside stood Mayor Whitman, Sheriff Coleman, Murphy, and other town leaders. They confronted William about his inquiries, warning him to stop stirring trouble. They claimed Ayanna had confessed, though William suspected coercion. When William protested, they dismissed his concerns and implied that his interference could cost him his status and safety. Faced with their veiled threats and unwavering stares, William felt a heavy clarity settle over him. These were men he had dined with, done business with, greeted on Sunday mornings with nods and handshakes. Yet now, their civility had curdled into something colder, an unspoken ultimatum that revealed just how deep the rot of denial and prejudice ran in Silverbrook. They didn't want truth, they wanted comfort. They didn't want justice, they wanted control. Ayanna's guilt had become a convenient narrative, one that upheld their illusion of order and preserved the hierarchy they depended on. To question her guilt was to question their worldview, and that was a price they weren't willing to pay. As the men disappeared into the night, their boots crunching down the path, William remained rooted on his porch, the lamplight flickering. Behind him, and the cool desert air wrapping around his shoulders, the lights of Silverbrook stretched below like stars scattered across a dark canvas, but they no longer looked warm or familiar. To William, they now resembled the cold glint of something lost in innocence he could no longer claim, a community he could no longer trust. Maria Crowfeather's words echoed with renewed gravity in his mind. Saving her will cost you more than money. He understood now it would cost him his place, his reputation, perhaps even his safety. The life he had built, the comfort he had taken for granted, would all be put at risk if he chose to follow this path to the end. What was that life worth if it required silence in the face of such injustice? The choice before him was no longer theoretical. It was real, urgent, and irreversible. And so the question pressed harder than ever, heavy and insistent. Could he act in time? Could he reach Ayanna before the forces aligned against her sealed her fate for good? Time was running out, and William Ashford knew that from this moment on, every second counted. Ayanna's false confession had been coerced through intimidation and veiled threats. Sheriff Coleman, Mayor Whitman, and 2 deputies had pressured her relentlessly, dangling promises of mercy and threatening her family, exhausted and desperate to protect her grandmother. Ayanna finally signed the fabricated statement, though it painted her as the very criminal the town wanted her to be. William Ashford discovered the truth through his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who heard from a source inside the mayor's household that Ayanna had been forced into the confession. Outraged, William debated his next steps. Waiting for the legal system risked Ayanna's safety, but acting outside, it meant breaking the law himself. Determined, William rode to a remote shack where he found damning evidence, stolen goods from Murphy's store, a letter addressed to Dutch detailing the gang's plans for a series of robberies, and a map targeting Apache communities as scapegoats. The documents proved Ayanna's innocence and revealed a broader criminal conspiracy rooted in racial manipulation. William presented the evidence to Sheriff Coleman, who acknowledged the mistake but hesitated to act, fearing political fallout and public backlash. Coleman suggested staging an escape to avoid scandal, but William refused. He gave Coleman an ultimatum: release Ayanna and issue a public apology by morning, or William would go to the territorial authorities and the press, anticipating inaction. William prepared to free Ayanna himself. That night, armed with supplies and resolve, he snuck to Murphy's barn. Cutting the lock, he found Ayanna weakened but alive. She feared reprisals against her family but changed her mind after William revealed the gang's plans and why he was helping her because justice, dignity, and compassion mattered more than wealth or reputation. As they prepared to flee town, officials arrived outside the barn, having discovered the plan. Faced with demands to surrender, William declared that Ayanna was worth the risk, and that if justice cost him everything, so be it. He and Ayanna escaped through a loose board in the barn and rode into the night, pursued by a town unwilling to face its own moral failure in that moment. William crossed a point of no return, leaving behind wealth and status to fight for something greater. As they vanished into the desert, the lights of Silverbrook receded behind them, while ahead lay an uncertain future shaped by courage and conviction. Their story, once rooted in prejudice and power, had become a legend of resistance, redemption, and the belief that justice is worth any cost when someone dares to fight for it. 6 months after the events in Silverbrook, the Arizona Territory was alive with talk of the Silverbrook scandal, which had drawn widespread attention and come to symbolize both frontier injustice and the hope of redemption. The gang responsible for the crimes was eventually apprehended, though not before further violence. William Ashford's evidence proved pivotal in their conviction, leading to the execution of their leader, Dutch Morrison. The trial revealed a chilling strategy. The gang had exploited racial prejudice by targeting towns near Native American communities, intending to frame local tribes. Sheriff Coleman resigned under pressure. Mayor Whitman's political aspirations ended, and Murphy's General Store faced a customer boycott. Yet the most profound change came in Silverbrook's relationship with the Apache reservation. Public shame and official pressure forced the town to acknowledge its bias. A new sheriff introduced joint patrols, an Apache liaison was appointed, and a formal apology was made to Ayanna and the wider Apache community. William never returned to his mansion. Instead, he used his wealth to found a legal aid group for Native Americans and marginalized people, relocating to a modest home in Phoenix to continue his work. While some authorities considered prosecuting him, public opinion shielded him, and he emerged as a symbol of moral courage. Ayanna, supported by William, completed her teacher training in California and returned to teach in both Silverbrook and the reservation. Her poise and intellect gradually transformed public perception. One evening, 6 months after the barn incident, Ayanna and William sat on the porch of the Apache Community Center. Reflecting, William admitted he regretted not acting sooner in life, but not the choices he made since that pivotal night. Ayanna, echoing her grandmother's wisdom, spoke of faith in justice and the value of witnessing each other's dignity. William asked a question that had long lingered: why she believed in justice, despite everything. Ayanna explained she believed because she had to, and because her grandmother taught her that good people would eventually reveal themselves if one held on to hope. As they parted, Ayanna shared one final lesson. In Apache tradition, saving a life creates responsibility for it, but sometimes the one saved becomes the savior. William realized that by saving Aina, he had also been saved finding his integrity and purpose as he looked out over the desert. William understood the true worth of what he had gained. He had lost wealth and status, but had found the courage to stand for justice. The story of him and Aina became legend, a tale of redemption and moral bravery. In the years to come, both continued their work in advocacy and education, showing that a single act of courage could ripple outward, changing communities and hearts. The tale of Silverbrook reminded people across the territory that justice could rise, like water wherever people were willing to dig deep enough. And in that, there was lasting hope. **